I don't like to interview politicians. They're boring and they just promote themselves. But Senator Rand Paul actually says interesting and important things. In this interview, we discuss his book, The Case Against Socialism. It begins with an unusual phrase. You start with, because eating your pets is overrated? That's not fair.
We're talking about Venezuela here. The contrast is between the general population, which has lost about 20 pounds, not from dieting because there's a lack of food, and contrast that with dear leader. You contrast that with Maduro, who's probably gained 50 pounds. In fact, I think it really sums up socialism in a way. There's still a well-fed top 1%. They just happen to be the government or those who are cronies or friends of the government.
People are eating their pets in Venezuela?
It's desperate. We tell the story of one young lady who was 16 years old, and she's part of a gang, but her territory are several trash dumpsters, and she keeps other people from foraging for food in those because she's in charge of those trash dumpsters for her and her gang to forage for food. That's pretty desperate times.
So you'd think you wouldn't have to write a book to make the case.
That's what a lot of people respond. They say, well, Case Against Socialism wasn't that decided. The case against Marx was decided, by von Bawerk and the economists in the 19th century. Von Mises said calculations impossible under socialism. All these arguments have been made. And then you see the 20th century, Hitler's socialism, Stalin's socialism, Mao's socialism. You would think people would have recognized by now. But each time, I think the socialists shift position, because there were socialists in our country who thought Stalin was a good idea. There were ones who were reading the little red book of Mao and thought he was a good idea, and then they eventually shift to something else. Bernie Sanders thought Castro was pretty good for a while.
He educated the kids, gave them health care, totally transformed the society.
He thought Chavez was good, but then they finally shift, and where they all wind up? They all wind up saying, but the kinder, gentler socialism that we want is Scandinavia. That's the kind of socialism, democratic socialism in Scandinavia.
When I talk about democratic socialism, I'm not looking at Venezuela. I'm not looking at Cuba. I'm looking at countries like Denmark and Sweden.
So we do a big chunk of the book in there talking about Scandinavia.
I congratulate you. Unlike most political books, which are just platitudes fed by your advisors, you did some actual research about socialism and Scandinavia, for example. And we learned
that actually Bernie is too much of a socialist for Scandinavia, that he probably could not get elected in any of the Scandinavian countries. And this is, I think, a surprise to both him and to a lot of his supporters, because when he started talking about Denmark being socialist, the Prime Minister of Denmark came out publicly and said, Bernie, quit it. You're bad for business. We are not socialist, and if the rest of the world thinks Denmark's socialist, they won't come here and invest money.
Denmark is far from a socialist planned economy.
We found that basically it's not true that the Scandinavian countries are socialist. Basically, they have private property, private stock exchange. When different freedom or economic indexes are listed, they're in the top 10 of the most free countries. Now, they do have a big welfare state. But we also learned that what Bernie promises and what AOC promises in our country is untrue. They say we're going to have a lot of free stuff that a socialist state gives you, but only the rich people are going to pay for it, only the top 1%. Turns out when you look at Scandinavia, everybody pays for it, particularly starting at the working class paying a 25% sales tax and then an income tax of 60% starting at $60,000. And really, the rich in our country pay a lot more.
60% for people making $60,000 a year. So they hit the middle class.
Yeah, and in our country, what you'd pay? Some people making $60,000 might not pay any, but they pay very, very little, less than 10%. Particularly with the new tax cut, we've taken a lot of people off on the bottom and the middle off of our rolls completely. But the rich pay a lot more in our country than they actually do in Scandinavia. So his whole stick it to the rich thing that he's promoting isn't true in Scandinavia. He says in our country, the corporate income taxes, the evil corporations aren't paying enough. Well, guess what? In Scandinavia, they've been 15 points below our corporate rates for 2 decades. We finally just lowered our corporate tax rate with the most recent tax cut to where they are in Scandinavia.
Now, Scandinavia did become kind of socialist around 1970.
Right.
One other thing I learned from your book, that of 38 major businesses in Sweden, 36 were founded before 1970, just 2 since.
Yeah, many of the great successes of Swedish industry and businesses came in the earlier part of the century. The other thing that they always promote is, oh, well, they live longer, they have higher incomes, all this stuff, and there's no poverty and everything. Everybody's so happy there. And there's an anecdote we recite in there of Milton Friedman. So the Swedish economist comes up to him and he says, well, you know, in Sweden we have no poverty. And Friedman responds and he says, well, yeah, in America we have no poverty among Swedish Americans. And so there's a
culture.
The culture, and it's you know, maybe we don't know the exact reason, but Swedish Americans in America actually have much higher incomes, live longer, etc.
Danish Americans have a 55% higher living standard than Danes. Swedish Americans, same thing.
Yeah, so not only are they higher than the average American, they're actually higher than Swedes who live in Sweden and Danes who live in Denmark. So all across the board, there are reasons, and there's a man by the name of Sendaji who's written a lot of these statistics, and basically he attributes it to cultural work ethic, that kind of thing.
So they have socialized health care, though not totally. And I found it interesting that Swedish men live longer than American men. They did before they had socialist health care.
For a long period of time, yes.
So they live 5 years longer. So now that they have socialized health care, they still live 5 years longer.
Exactly.
No different.
And so this is the trick of statistics. It's sort of cause and effect. You can say, oh, well, the Swedes live longer and they have socialized medicine. And yet, if you look hard at the statistics, you're exactly right. It started way before socialized medicine.
For more of my content, go to johnstossel.com. I post a new short video every Tuesday. That's at johnstossel.com. Now Gallup says 57% of Democrats view socialism favorably. They don't really know what it is.
That's the thing, is you can look at it and be really alarmed, which I kind of am alarmed. It's part of the reason why my wife and I wrote this book, is we were seeing all these polls of young people who were saying, you know what, over 50% of young people just in general, not just Democrats, but 50% of all young people think socialism is a good idea. But Reason and others have done follow-up polls, and they say, well, what is socialism? And like only about 15 or 16% of these people know or would attribute it that it means the government owning, you know, the means of production or owning most property. And so I think really, and we talk some about this because really the danger is, one, they don't know what it is, but they say they're for it. But the danger also is they're for some vague things. And if you read the Democrat Socialists of America, AOC's party, and you read their website, the things they're for, they've made it to sound really good. It's sort of like we're for fairness and we're for equality. So we try to point out in the book that the only way you can enforce those things is you have to have an equality police or a fairness police, and ultimately they show up with truncheons. And we talk about how that's happened in societies. The Red Guard, we tell a story of the Red Guard coming to a friend of mine's mother's house. A friend of mine who's an ophthalmologist in Nashville. His dad was a physician, his mom was a physician. He was born a few years before me, and was brought up when the Cultural Revolution came about. Mao said nobody goes to school. So you know how big a country China is. Nobody went to college for like 4 or 5 years, and he tried to study secretly in his dad's med school class because his dad taught med school until the government caught him, and he was guilty of, you know, trying to learn illegally. But one day the Red Guard came to his mother's lab, and she heard they were coming, and she ran through the streets to try to stop them. But they beat her within an inch of her life, broke bones throughout her body, and she laid in bed for a year until she could heal, and then she was exiled. And people say, oh, that's not what we want. We want Scandinavia. But one of the themes of the book is violence inherent to socialism?
Yeah, you say a boot stamping on the human face forever. But that's not fair. They would say, today we're going to do it with kindness.
Yeah.
And maybe they will.
And that's their other argument. It's sort of going to be kinder and gentler.
Why does it always lead to a boot stamping on your face forever?
One of the points, and that was made by several people, there's George Reisman has written about this, and he says that the reason you eventually get to violence is that if you want complete socialism, you want the government to completely own everything, you know, the real socialism that people say they want, you have to take the property from people. So if I tax you 50%, I'm taking 50% of your property, and maybe you don't resist. But there comes a point in time when I come to your house and say 4 other families are going to live with you, and I come to your factory and I take your factory from you. When all of these things happen, there's a point at which there's resistance. And it's not an accident that the best kind of socialist leader ends up having to be ruthless, because you can't be a kinder, gentler socialist leader and get the property. So as you get like, Pol Pot in Cambodia, he really dramatically wanted socialism. He wanted it quickly, and he sent all the people from the city into the country, and he made everybody equal almost immediately when he could. He collectivized all the farms, but it required the killing of millions of people. I mean, that's where people talk about the killing fields of Cambodia.
All right, but the American socialists wouldn't do that.
Right. That's what they say. And if they want sort of to go halfway through a democratic welfare state, maybe they can get there. It's going to be majority rule. I was recently at Columbia University, and I made the point to them is that something that a majority passes doesn't make it right or acceptable. And I think Martin Luther King got this in the letter from Birmingham jail. He writes that an unjust law is one that a majority passes but doesn't make binding on themselves. So it's more complicated than just a majority passing a law. It's sort of this equal protection or equal justice, that everybody is treated the same by the law. But if they really want socialism, where they're going to take the property, I think in the end it requires violence. They also have to explain why time after time, was Hitler an anomaly? Was Stalin an anomaly? Was Mao an anomaly? Was Castro? I mean, we have all of these examples. It's not like we have one-offs, of an occasional despot or dictator. We have a whole lineage of them. In fact, it's hard to look back historically and find some great democratic socialists who didn't evolve into authoritarianism, even the ones who were originally elected.
For more of my content, go to johnstossel.com. I post a new short video every Tuesday. That's at johnstossel.com. Where are these angels, you write? This claim of selfless rulers appeals to people, but they just don't appear.
And this is another sort of argument against this, and this has been an argument for a long time. Plato talked about having these selfless philosopher kings. Karl Popper, who we quote a lot in here, was really one of those who looked at that and said, well, it just defies man's nature. Murray Rothbard said the same. And so the Soviets, as they did it, they said, well, yeah, it defies man's nature, but we're going to reshape man's nature, and we're going to have a new Soviet man. So even the Soviets admitted people weren't ready for this. But they, and this dialectical materialism that Marx talked about, we were going to eventually get there. And you get there, I guess, it takes some brute force ultimately to get there, but they never have gotten there. And that's why we have some discussion of utopia, is that the idea of man's perfectibility, maybe man is not perfectible, but really, how do you want to get to these different places you get? Are you going to get there through the force of government, or are you going to let society evolve through the voluntarism of people trading with each other? With socialism, if you want to have equality of outcome, if everybody's going to be the same in the end, in the ultimate end, everybody's going to be the same, the law has to treat them unequally because everybody's different. I mentioned to the kids in the auditorium, I said, there's 400 kids in the auditorium. If we give you $1,000 and you go outside the door, 10 minutes later, you're going to start redistributing it. You're going to start trading each other for things. And 2 days later, somebody's going to have more money and some less. But to make you all equal again, if I have to keep equalizing you every day, I've got to treat you unequally. I've got to punish those who are successful.
Most people would say that's fair. Some of us have an advantage. If I'm rich, take more from me. That's just.
I guess, though, if you replace what we have, which is largely based on merit, with somebody else deciding it, is then the government deciding it. And you are right. There will be always a redistribution of wealth, but it ends up being done by either government or a system where it's done voluntarily. And a lot of times people talk about in our country or in countries that are more free that we have a democratic capitalism. And the reason it's democratic, that's the ultimate democracy. It's a direct democracy every day. You vote either for Walmart or you vote for Target or you vote for Kroger. You vote with your feet, with your wallet, and with your money. And the people who succeed are the people who get the most votes, which are dollars. And as long as it's free and there's no coercion, it seems to me that would be the most just way of distributing a nation's economy, as opposed to you elect someone to office, and if you give them money or you're friends of theirs, then you get the benefits of getting more than others would.
The cure for failed socialism is always more socialism.
I think that each time they've tried it, they say, well, we didn't have real socialism. And this is a common complaint. As you look through history, it's sort of like, what is Castro's complaint? He said it's all America's fault. Socialism would have worked except for America, not trading with us. Or Venezuela. Still in Venezuela, most of the complaints are it's, foreigners manipulating their currency and doing things to their currency. It's never the fault of socialism. So then you get more, and you get more, and you get more. And ultimately, it typically has descended into violence.
Socialism and climate change alarmism go together.
In a way, because if you read some of the leaders in the climate change or the climate alarmism group, what you'll find is they'll explicitly tell you that it's less about pollution and more about redistributing wealth from the richer nations to the poorer nations. They don't even hide this from view that it really is about redistributing wealth. When you look at these accords, like the Paris Accord, well, what the U.S. has to do is quite dramatic. What India and China have to do is much less dramatic, where the pollution that they're measuring is coming from is much greater from the developing nations than it is from the advanced nations.
America's part socialist.
Yes, we're sort of in the middle. And we talk a little bit about that because one of the arguments from socialists is that, you say it takes force to redistribute wealth. Well, we already do it, so we already are using force. And I guess my response to that is, yes, all government requires force. As my father often said, yes, taxation is theft. But that's why we want not a lot of it. We want as little as we can possibly have and still have a country. And so I think it's an argument for minimizing the amount of force that government uses. And government does have to use force through taxation. So we want to have the minimal amount of government, the minimal amount of taxation. And then there are some who argue for no government, but there are some of us who say, we really do need some government. We just don't want too much, that we want to maximize our liberty, which means we want government to be as small as possible.
But most Americans seem to be saying we want more. I mean, when you ran for president, I had high hopes. This was going to be the libertarian moment. The crowd was cheering, "Run, Rand Paul, run, Rand Paul." You came up and said, "We have come to take our country back."
Right.
What happened?
I would say that either the people aren't ready or perhaps the people in the Republican primary aren't ready. I think the thing about being a libertarian, someone who's fiscally conservative, but also tolerant, and then also believes that our foreign policy has been too interventionist around the world, is that it captures a little bit of everybody. There are people in the Democrat Party who actually believe with some of the foreign policy and some of the privacy and some of the personal liberty. There are people in the Republican Party who believe in balanced budgets and fiscal responsibility. They're not all in the same party, so when you run for president, it's difficult. People say, well, run as an independent or run as a libertarian. That's also very difficult because the rules have been skewed for a long time, how you get on the ballot, et cetera, and that it's hard to get to a certain number as a third-party candidate where people say, I'm not just throwing my vote away, I'm going to vote because now you actually have a chance. So it's difficult. I don't know when it happens. I can tell you there weren't enough people in Iowa for us to think that we could go on. But there still is a movement out there, and there still are people that see a little bit of what Republicans do as well, a little bit of what Democrats do as well, and think that there would be some way to bring those movements together.
Thanks for listening. New episodes drop the first and third Mondays of every month. You can subscribe everywhere you get podcasts.